Boa tarde. Vou falar em português porque não tem nenhum professor que não fale português, porque a Nina fala português. Ela vai fazer a apresentação dela em inglês, mas ela compreende perfeitamente o português. Então, vamos começar a última sessão desse ótimo seminário, né, muito interessante, com a apresentação da Nina, a Nina Kaltenbrunner. Ela vai falar uma meia hora e depois teremos os comentários da professora Daniela Prats.
Oi, boa tarde. Não vou falar em português, não. That's too difficult.
É só para mostrar que ela realmente fala português.
But I'm going to speak very, very slowly, so I hope you understand. Thanks a lot for coming. It's nice to see you, and I hope to see some of you in Leeds, where I'm there. I've joined 2 years ago. I did my PhD in SOAS, and I've joined 2 years ago. And what I'm going to present today is part of what I did in my PhD. So it's still some of my PhD results, which I'm going to present to you. And it's the first time I'm presenting it in front of a Brazilian audience. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing your opinion. Now, before I start, I was told to remind you that, there will be 2 scholarships for people wanting to study at Leeds. Whoa. There will be 2 scholarships for masters, and there will be 1 scholarship for a PhD, a 3-year PhD. There will be fees. The application deadline is at the end of June. So if you're interested, the application deadline is end of June. And if you are interested, please do get in contact with Silvana de Paula. She's the one who organized it. If you're not sure about Silvana's email, contact one of your professors, and I'm sure he or she will be able to pass it on. Yeah. So if you're thinking about going abroad, if you're thinking about going to Leeds, there are 2 scholarships. 3 actually, 2 for masters and 1 for PhD. Okay? Good. So what I'm going to present today is part of my PhD results, which I'm hopefully going to publish at some point. And I did it together with a friend of mine who did the PhD with me, who is Brazilian and who works for the Brazilian Central Bank. So when it comes to the technicalities of the central bank operations and the financial system, then I will hopefully be able to represent him, but probably not as good as he could do it. So what is the paper about, or what we're trying to do is ultimately it does go back to the big question about macroeconomic management in emerging countries in the presence of capital openness and in the presence of very large capital flows. And I probably don't need to tell you that at all. I would probably say a lot of things which are absolutely obvious to you. But Brazil has had probably one of its biggest influxes of capital over the last years, and also largest outflows, which has created problems with the exchange rate. So what we have seen is, despite quite substantial intervention of the central bank in the foreign exchange market, particularly the appreciation, we have had quite strong swings in the exchange rate. So as you know, the real appreciated from 2003 from nearly 4 to 1.5 in August 2008, and then depreciated again by 60%. And that is all despite the interventions of the central bank. Now that is in a way nothing new. We know, Gary, for those of you who were here this morning, we know that we're facing an impossible trinity. We know it's very difficult to combine capital flow mobility, exchange rate management, and independent monetary policy. So that is nothing new. What we are saying in this paper is that actually that impossible trinity becomes even worse if you're combining your attempt to manage the exchange rate with an inflation targeting regime. So we're arguing that due to some features of the inflation targeting regime and the way the inflation targeting regime shapes financial market behavior, the way it influences the way people in the financial sector operate, that impossible trinity becomes even worse. So we're calling it on steroids. Yeah? And what the paper does is it tries to show what are the mechanisms through which an inflation targeting regime makes that exchange rate management even worse or even impossible or even counterproductive. Although my central bank, so Juan always said, don't say counterproductive, it's not true. But I would argue it's even counterproductive to intervene in the foreign exchange market. And possibly come to some policy conclusions which I suppose most of you would agree with. So either to explicitly manage the exchange rate, give up the inflation targeting regime and make the exchange rate more an explicit target, which I think the Central Bank of Brazil has done more recently. So I think with Dilma and with the new Central Bank president there has been some change. And obviously capital controls, because what it obviously boils down to is the difficulty to manage the exchange rate in an open capital account in the presence of very large and volatile capital flows. So if we want to make the exchange rate a policy instrument again, which I feel very strongly we, a developing and emerging country should, then we will need some form of regulations on capital controls. And I know that Daniela is working on that, and also Barbara. Okay, so what I'm going to do in the next, hopefully only 20-25 minutes, I'm going to talk very, very quickly about the literature on the exchange rate in an inflation targeting regime. So I'm going to locate what we're doing into that literature. Then I'm going to give a very, very quick overview of the macroeconomic scenarios of the capital flows and inflation targeting regime. I'm going to keep this very short because I'm sure you all know much more about this than I do, and I feel very, very humbled to tell you about the Brazilian monetary regime. Then I'm going to quickly talk through the mechanisms through which I think an inflation targeting operates or influences financial market behavior and makes exchange rate management difficult. And then what I'm going to do finally is, in order to prove these mechanisms, I'm going to show you some results from interviews with currency traders, which I did during my PhD. I did 52 semi-structured interviews with currency traders here in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, and also in London. So I talked to them and I found out, so how do the central bank operations affect your positions in the Brazilian real? How did it affect the operations? And I want to show that some of the mechanisms are indeed present there. So what's the contribution? The contribution is that, A, it points to another possibility of doing an inflation targeting regime in emerging markets, the many high interest rates, the cost of controlling inflation, but also particularly the exchange rate. I'm going to present empirical evidence for that difficulty to combine the exchange rate with inflation targeting regime, and I'm going to do that qualitatively. So there are a few contributions which have done that with econometrics or with data, or have said, there might be can I just put this away? Can you hear me without the mic? Yeah.
I think you.
Yeah. So I think people who have said that there might be a potential conflict between the exchange rate and the inflation targeting regime, even people in the World Bank and the IMF, but nobody has really kind of tried to really understand what is going on in the financial market and where do the problems come from. So I think probably the biggest contribution of that paper is to actually go to financial market people and talk to them and say, well, so how does an inflation targeting regime affect your behavior? Okay, let's have a quick look what the literature says. So, as you probably know, in the original conception of an inflation targeting regime, there should be no role for the exchange rate. Yeah? Because of the impossible trinity, in an open capital account, if I have free capital movements, and if I make an inflation targeting regime, then the exchange rate has to be let floated freely to the market. Now, we know that in developing and emerging countries, that is not the case. We all know across the globe that most of emerging market governments do intervene, and some of them quite strongly in the exchange rate. That's probably you're familiar with the fear of floating or fear of appreciation literature. So very few governments in developing countries are actually letting the exchange rate float. So that's common language. And it's also common language, or as a result of this, there's quite a bit of literature which argues, well, why don't we just include the exchange rate into the monetary policy function of the central bank? If it's so important for developing countries, and people are acknowledging that, there's nobody saying that is not the case, well, why don't we just combine them? Why don't we just have an inflation targeting regime and we manage the exchange rate at the same time? Yeah? And the IMF and the World Bank and other international institutions are advocating exactly that. In order to make that work, they have to advocate that the interest rate has to be the main policy instrument. They advocate everything has to be in a very transparent, credible, and consistent manner. And as long as developing countries' governments do that, that trade-off between the inflation targeting regime and the exchange rate management should be minimized, and it should be possible. Now, what we are arguing is, well, that might well be the case if you have an exchange rate depreciation. That's fine. Because if the exchange rate depreciates, you're worried about your path-through to inflation, you raise interest rates, and that's consistent with the inflation targeting regime. Happy with that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So depreciation is absolutely consistent. There is no problem. Or a balance sheet effect. I'm worried about my domestic balance sheets in the financial or non-financial corporations. So in the case of depreciation, I'm intervening. Now the problem is that becomes inconsistent, or the possibility to manage the exchange rate in an inflation targeting regime becomes inconsistent when I have a strong appreciation as a result of capital inflows. Because if I'm in an inflation targeting regime, what I would want is I would want the exchange rate to appreciate, because that allows us to control inflation, especially in a country where other monetary transmission mechanisms don't work that fine. So in principle, what I would want to see, or an appreciating exchange rate, actually helps us to control inflation. Yeah? And now the attempt to hold that appreciation in an inflation targeting regime will be very difficult, if not inconsistent, because the financial sector knows that there is an inherent inconsistency between the two aims. And the financial sector knows that ultimately the government will not hold that appreciation, or the government favors a more appreciated exchange rate to control inflation. And as a result of that knowledge, they will speculate in the exchange rate. They will go even further into that country. They will build even larger positions, which makes that management or the attempt to control the exchange rate even more difficult. Yeah? And that's what we're trying to show in that paper. Now, as I've said before, there's not much literature on, so if you're looking for a master's dissertation topic or even PhD, there's relatively very little literature on foreign exchange interventions in emerging markets. There is even less literature when it comes to foreign exchange interventions in an inflation targeting regime. I found 3 papers and I've looked for a while. If you find any more, if there are any Brazilian papers which I haven't found, please do send them to me. Daniela has already said there's some. Now, what these papers show is that actually it's true. So if I combine an inflation targeting regime and exchange rate management, in the depreciation period, it's fine, it all works. But what that literature shows is that when it comes to appreciation, exchange rate intervention becomes ineffective in an inflation targeting regime. So halting an appreciation trend in an inflation targeting regime is ineffective due to empirical and econometric literature. And what we're doing in the paper is we're going to show with the interviews why that is the case. Yeah? Everybody happy up to now? Good. Okay, then let's go. I need to do that with my students as well. Given that we have primarily students here, and then my students always do it like, yeah, it's fine. And then the really shy, the really, really brave ones go, no, I really have no clue what you're talking about. So please do, because otherwise I'm going to lose. And then then they come afterwards into my office hour and say, oh, I didn't get that. It's like, why didn't you say it in the first place? Anyway, so here we go. That is easier. So what was the macroeconomic scenario in Brazil? You all have seen that. I've given you here the capital account. So the green ones are the portfolio flows, the blue ones are other investment, just like that everywhere. And the red one is the current account. Yeah? The only thing I want to show you here is, first of all, obviously the volatility of short-term capital flows, but also the amount of money which has come into Brazil in the time before the crisis, so in around 2007, 2008, until the failure of Lehman Brothers. So that's that huge spike here. Yeah? So loads of money going into Brazil, loads of money pulling out when Lehman Brothers failed. And then, even more interestingly, since the failure of Lehman Brothers, even more money coming in when the Eurozone crisis accelerated. And then, again, the huge adjustment recently as the Eurozone crisis accelerates and people get worried and pull out again. Yeah? So very strong volatility in capital flows and immense size, unprecedented size in terms of money going into Brazil. At the same time, you've got an inflation targeting regime. I'm really not going to go into this. You have a target of 2%. You have to meet that. The central bank needs to be independent. The central bank needs to tell the market exactly why it is doing what it is doing. It has to issue statements and so on and so forth. Importantly, the BCB, the Brazilian Central Bank, has been very good. They have met the inflation targets nearly every time. There's one year where they didn't meet it, and I forgot which one it was. If anybody of you knows it, let me know. But there was one year, I think at the beginning, around the Lula crisis, where they didn't meet it. But apart from that, they've met the inflation target regime for all 10 years. Now, however, despite that inflation targeting regime, and despite the official mantra to ignore the exchange rate, the central bank has intervened very, very strongly in the foreign exchange market. Yeah? So what I've shown you here is, I'm going to show this here. So the red line are the spot purchases. Yeah? So this is what the central bank has bought in the spot market. Yeah? So obviously, if that is positive, then the central bank is buying US dollar, so it's trying to hold the appreciation of the Brazilian real. If it's negative, then they're selling US dollar, so they're trying to hold the depreciation. Okay? The green line is the swap. Yeah? Because as you know, the Brazilian central bank has not only been intervening in the spot market, but because you have such a liquid and highly traded derivative market, they've actually migrated to the derivatives market in order to manage the exchange rates. Now, if that is negative, the green line, then we have a reverse swap. So that means the central bank is buying the US dollar forward. Again, it's trying to hold the appreciation. If it's positive, then the central bank is selling a normal swap. So they're selling US dollars, so they're trying to hold the depreciation. Okay? And since then, since the international financial crisis, the central bank has pretty much evened out its FX swap operations. So we can see that the central bank has intervened heavily, and at the same time, foreign exchange reserves have surged. Yeah? So as a result of the FX intervention, we have a very large foreign exchange reserves. Now, one could argue one reason why the central bank intervened was actually to accumulate these foreign exchange reserves, to kind of build a war chest against financial crisis. But then the question is, well, why does it intervene in the derivatives market? Because if I'm only interested in accumulating a lot of foreign exchange reserves to make sure I'm protected against international financial crisis, the only thing I need is the foreign exchange reserves. But clearly the central bank was also worried about the exchange rate itself. Yeah? So the central bank was worried about the exchange rate appreciation and the effect on the real economy, because otherwise it wouldn't have intervened in the derivatives market as well. Yeah? Well, however, despite that strong appreciation, and I know that graph is a bit mucky, you can't really see it very well, but the exchange of real has appreciated very strongly. As I said before, from 4 in around 2003 to around 1.8 in August 2008. Yeah? I was doing my interviews, if anybody's interested, I was doing my interviews exactly at that point, and I remember talking to the traders, and the traders, I was talking to them, and I was asking them, so what do you think is going to happen? And nobody really knew. And that was the point where the real turned and where the money started going out. Yeah, so it depreciated strongly in the international financial crisis and has appreciated again afterwards. Yeah? So despite, just to summarize, we have strong capital inflows. The central bank intervenes quite strongly in order to stop that appreciation trend, but nevertheless we have continuing capital inflows and continuing appreciation. Now, why is that the case? What problem does an inflation targeting regime create for a central bank when it tries to manage the exchange rates? Let's have a look. Well, the first one is obviously the interest rate. If I'm using the short-term interest rate as my main policy instrument, then I will have probably a bias towards a higher exchange rate, towards a higher interest rate. And we know the Brazilian interest rate, real interest rate, was one of the highest in the world, if not the highest. I think it's only Turkey which has taken over recently. And secondly, I'm making the interest rate movements very predictable. Because every time inflation goes beyond the target, or risks going beyond the target, what the central bank needs to do is to raise its interest rate. Now, if I know that, every trader in the city will know that. Yeah? So they will know when the inflation goes outside, then probably the central bank will raise the interest rate, and then I'm going to go into this country. So monetary policy becomes very predictable and becomes very easy to speculate on for a foreign investor. And obviously a foreign investor will go into a country which is predictable, transparent, and credible, because the risk of loss is much smaller. Yeah? So that increases the attractiveness of foreign capital flows, or for attractiveness of international capital flows. The second way an inflation targeting regime plays to financial markets behavior makes it interesting for foreigners and to investors. You have to imagine, I talked to hedge funds in the city. These guys trade probably around 15 different developing countries. They don't have time to study in depth every single monetary arrangement a country has. However, if you have an inflation targeting regime, that's pretty much the same across all countries because it's the same institutional arrangement. So in a way, it makes it much easier to analyze a monetary framework and monetary policy for somebody who trades many different countries across the world. So again, that makes it much more attractive to invest in a country where you know the institutional framework, where you know what's going to happen, rather than having some dodgy government somewhere in Vietnam, which is kind of managing the exchange rate, but they're not really managing the exchange rate. I'd rather put my fingers off that. But in Brazil, very predictable. Yeah? So that's the first way we would argue an inflation targeting regime affects financial market behavior. The second way is actually, and I think I've mentioned that already a bit at the beginning, is actually the way the central bank will manage the exchange rate itself. Yeah? So in a way, what an inflation targeting regime creates is a bit of a tilt towards an asymmetric intervention. So whereas there's no motivation to intervene when there's an appreciation, or ultimately not really a motivation to hold an appreciation because it helps with controlling inflation, you will be very worried with the depreciation because the depreciation will probably feed into domestic prices through the pass-through. You will not meet your inflation targeting and you're forced to raise the interest rate. Yeah? So you have an asymmetry in the foreign exchange intervention, you have an asymmetry in exchange rate behavior, and that is an asymmetry which is very, very profitable for foreign investors. Because that means on the appreciation, they can make money. The appreciation trend is in a way guaranteed. But on the other hand, the central bank is capping the risk because they will intervene to hold the depreciation as much as they can. And foreign investors know that. Yeah? So in a way, you're offering very high returns and you're capping the risks on the depreciation. Now, another way, I'm not talking so much about this in this paper, another indirect way the central bank has actually helped foreign investors is by being counterparty. Yeah? When foreign investors come in, they need to sell their foreign exchange to somebody, right? I need to have a counterparty. Now, what the central bank does I don't have the graph anymore. When I showed you that green line, yeah? What the central bank does is by intervening in the foreign exchange market, it actually acts as such a counterparty to the foreign investors. So when the foreign investor wants to sell, the central bank buys. Yeah? So they will actually have somebody who provides the domestic currency to them, which is the central bank, which further stimulates the capital inflows. Yeah? So that's that's not specific to an inflation targeting regime, but that's an indirect way through which foreign exchange operations can actually attract capital or stimulate capital inflows. Okay, and then the final mechanism through which an inflation targeting regime can affect or make it more difficult to manage the exchange rate is through money market operations themselves. Yeah? So, because every time the central bank buys foreign exchange from the market, the money supply will increase, right? The market has the foreign exchange. I'm buying the foreign exchange from them. What do I need to give them in turn? Well, probably real. Yeah? So the money supply increases. Now, in order to make sure the money supply doesn't increase, the central bank needs to sterilize the operations. So they're selling very short-term government bonds to the domestic banking sector. Okay? Okay? So very short-term government bonds with the domestic banking sector. Now, that has two effects. The first one is that the central bank, or the government, if you want so, has to maintain the interest rate slightly higher because they need to create the demand for these bonds. The second, and I'm not going to bore you with the graph, this is just to show you the rise in these treasury bonds. The second is that you're giving your banking sector very, very short-term assets, which the banking sector can sell at any time. Yeah? So when it comes to the crisis and the banking sector wants to get out, it's very easy to sell these short-term government bonds. So in a way, you're helping the domestic banking sector to speculate against your own currency because you're providing them with these very short-term assets through the sterilization operations. Yeah? Okay, so these are the mechanisms. I can see your faces going like this when she's done. I'm done. Mechanisms are over. Yeah. So it's interest rate, it's asymmetric intervention, and its credibility, and so on and so forth. Yeah? Right. Now let's have a look what the traders say. So what I'm going to show you in the last 4 graphs, bear with me, is what did the traders say when I talked to them about this, when I kind of wanted to find out how do you feel about central bank operations. Just to give you an idea, I talked to 52 people, I've already said that. I talked to 31 people in Brazil, 21 offshore. I talked to banks, funds, hedge funds managers, what have you. I mainly talk to proprietary traders, so I only talk to the people who actually take positions, so not just to the flow traders, the ones who kind of give the prices. I talk to those who actually take the speculative decisions. And I mainly, when I go through the results, I mainly focus on, whether a trader was onshore or offshore, so whether it was a Brazilian trader or whether it was somebody trading from the City of London. And I asked them 4 questions. First of all, I was interested, well, how do you kind of consider central bank operations themselves? I talked to them about the inflation targeting regime. How does an inflation targeting regime affect your trading? I talked to them about the crisis. And finally, I wanted to find out, well, given all what we talked about, what would be your favorable exchange rate regime? If you could choose, if you could tell the Brazilian central bank what exchange rate management to do, what would you ask them to do? Okay? Let's have a look at the first one. So just to give you an idea, so I talked to, I got 22 responses, more, 22 onshore and 17 offshore, and these are the things which people mentioned. Yeah, so I asked open questions. I didn't give them anything. This is just what came out from the interviews and what the traders thought was important. But what you can see is that what is important for them is the liquidity provision, so it's getting money if they want to get out, and it's the reserves. Yeah, so the amount of reserves the central bank has. Interesting, so that was for the onshore traders. So what for the onshore traders, it's important to get the liquidity from the central bank and to have that amount of foreign exchange reserves in order to be able to close their positions. For the foreign traders, what was important was particularly this, what I was talking about, the predictability and transparency of the monetary framework and the interest rate, obviously. So they would choose a country which had a predictable and credible monetary framework, and obviously where the interest rates were high and predictable. Yeah? That capital controls element, that came up primarily with the offshore traders because I was doing these interviews just when Brazil introduced their capital controls. So they were very worried about that at that time, and that's probably the reason why it didn't come up with the onshore traders. Yeah, so what we had the Brazilian central bank was considered very, very important. We had very different views from the onshore and the offshore traders, which has to do with the trading horizon, and which has to do whether you trade only the Brazilian real or whether you trade many, many currencies. And what we also had, and I think that was probably one of the most interesting results for me, is that what the traders and what the financial market participants said is that actually, for them, the central bank intervening in the foreign exchange market helped them building their positions, or in a way motivated them building their position rather than stopping it. Why? Well, because of that asymmetric interventions I told you before. They knew the central bank is not going to really hold the appreciation. They knew it would appreciate further, but they also knew there was some risk capping. Because of the counterparty, they had the central bank to sell to. And interesting, for those traders who didn't have access to flows, the central bank buying was a sign that there was money coming in. So whenever the central bank bought, they knew there was a lot of capital flow going into Brazil, so they knew that probably exchange would appreciate further, so they bought further. Yeah? So that was general. So there was strong presence of the Brazilian central bank, difference between onshore and offshore, and a very strong feeling that the attempt of the Brazilian central bank to manage the exchange would actually fooled or kind of motivated the position rather than stopping them. Now, what about the inflation targeting regime? Well, I think there was nothing too surprising. So what people thought an inflation targeting regime did is increase the predictability and increase the credibility of an regime. Predictability was primarily about the interest rate. So foreign players, foreign investors thought it was very convenient to have an inflation targeting regime because it was very clear what would happen with the interest rate. The Brazilian traders were primarily interested or worried about the pass-through, so they were more worried about inflation, whereas the foreigners were about the interest rate setting. Now, what about the crisis? In the international financial crisis, the traders were very happy with the Brazilian central bank. Yeah? So they were all very pleased because the central bank provided as much liquidity as they wanted. I had some traders, I have not many quotes, but I give you one quote. Basically what they said, that was a foreigner saying, if I needed money, if I needed to get out of a position, and remember, in the international financial crisis, the problem was liquidity. Nobody had cash. So if they wanted cash, they came to Brazil. They sold their Brazilian assets because they knew the central bank would give them the money in order to meet the problems they had outside. Yeah? And that's one of the reasons why the real depreciated so much. Because Brazil was the country they could sell. Other countries they couldn't sell. Brazil they could sell because the central bank was there to give them all the money. Yeah? And interestingly, all of them expected the central bank to intervene. So whereas there was no expectations that the central bank would hold the appreciation, all of them, and they even told the central bank to do so, they called the central bank and said, intervene, thought they would cap the risk on the depreciation. Yeah? So there was a clear perception in the financial market that there was an asymmetry in foreign exchange intervention which helped them to build a position and make profits. And I know I've talked for a very long time, and I know you are nearly at the end of your attention span. What I do when my students do this, you know how the attention span of a student looks like? It's basically, I don't have anything to draw, but it's basically like this. Yeah? So at the beginning, nobody listens to you because you're all still getting your whatever out, your pan out and everything. Then for the first 10 minutes of our lecture, you're all there, you're all very motivated, and then it declines exponentially. So you're probably down there now. So, but I've only one graph left. Yeah? Now, what about the exchange rate management itself? So clearly, if an inflation targeting is so great and exchange rate management didn't work, I wanted to know, well, what would be the kind of exchange rate regime you wanted? And here I was very surprised. Because what I thought a trader would want is a floating exchange rate. Because with a floating exchange rate, there's no frictions, there's no inefficiencies, you can speculate, you can make money. Perfect. No. It actually turned out that the most profitable and the most best exchange rate regime for a trader is actually a managed float, is something which the Brazilian central bank has been doing and actually most emerging markets have been doing. Exactly for that reason. Because it takes the risk out, you make money but you don't have any risk, and it helps them to build the position. So it helps them to really predict what's going to happen with the exchange rate, and it helps them to make very big positions and make more money. Yeah? And as a result of that combination, that kind of volatility smoothing, if you want, so the framework of an inflation targeting regime, very often the attempt by the central bank to manage the exchange rate, to hold the appreciation, becomes inefficient and even counterproductive, because the way they're doing it means that more money is coming in and the currency appreciates even more. Yeah? And I had a point about capital controls. If anybody's interested how different traders think about capital controls, I can tell you about that. I'm not going to do it now because I've bored you long enough. I can tell you in the question. So yeah, so that's the conclusion. So basically our argument is that if you want to manage your exchange rate, which I think most countries would want to do, is then you will have to give up an inflation targeting regime. You will have to either make the exchange rate your explicit target, and you have to tell the market so. And that's what Trader also told me. If you want to make sure exchange rate, make it explicit and tell the market. Singapore is doing it and Singapore is working. I'm not saying it's easy, but then do it. And as I said, I think the Brazilian Central Bank has started to do this. Now, probably at the same time, I'm not naive. Probably just doing exchange rate management would not work. You will, at some point, you will need some restrictions on capital flows if you want to use the exchange rate as a development instrument, or if you want to influence the exchange rate value. But for that, I refer you to Daniela, who is much more expert on that. Okay, thank you very much. I hope it wasn't too boring, too difficult.
Thank you. Obrigada, professora Nina, por essa excelente apresentação, foi muito boa. Agora os comentários da professora Daniela.
Boa tarde. Eu tive mais sorte que o Braga, porque eu preparei em inglês e vou poder falar em português. Então, realmente, me sinto bem mais à vontade. Agora, meus comentários estão em inglês, mas aí não tenho que ficar... a Nina, então, primeiro, gostei muito do paper, eu conheço seu trabalho, né? E essa parte, particularmente, da tese eu não conhecia, então gostei muito. Acho que a gente segue uma abordagem muito parecida, né? Então, assim, eu reconheço várias partes aqui, inclusive de análise de textos meus no seu texto, então realmente foi muito prazeroso, mas também aprendi bastante, né? Então, assim, os meus comentários vão ser mais no sentido de ressaltar alguns pontos que não estão ressaltados aqui, mas eu sei que você conhece, que concordaria, fazer algumas ressalvas, um pouco assim, falar da minha visão sobre a gestão da política monetária no Brasil desde o governo Lula, e que eu acho que houve importantes mudanças, né, e que eu acho que são questões também que você pode depois trabalhar, se você continuar no tema, né? E eu queria terminar com uma questão mais geral, que eu acho também que é um tema que a gente pode trabalhar em conjunto, dado o convênio entre as duas universidades, né? Então, em relação a metas de inflação no Brasil, antes, só um comentário geral, isso aqui também nossos alunos estão cansados de saber, e você que a crítica à adoção do regime de metas de inflação em qualquer país, né? Então, você até coloca isso no começo, né? Em função dos próprios fundamentos teóricos subjacentes, né? Moeda neutra, etc. Então, ponto de partida, esse regime não é apropriado, né, para economias monetárias, economias capitalistas. Aí vem o segundo plano de análise, que você destaca bastante, que no caso das economias emergentes, é mais complicado ainda adotar regime de meta de inflação, devido principalmente à questão da taxa de câmbio, né? E você usa o termo trindade impossível, né? A gente usa bastante esse termo aqui, eu só queria aproveitar para fazer dois comentários. Primeiro, acho que esse termo, ele tem implicitamente a hipótese de que os 3 vértices do triângulo são objetivos a serem atingidos, né? Aproveitando a palestra do Gary, né, que é a estabilidade da taxa de câmbio, livre mobilidade de capital e autonomia da política monetária. Então, uma questão importante, eu acho, para a gente pensar, a gente discutir, que a gente acaba usando esses termos muitas vezes, porque são os termos da nossa, né, da literatura, e sem fazer a crítica. Por quê? Por que eu estou chamando a atenção para isso? Porque a ideia que livre mobilidade de capitais é desejável é questionável, né? Então, particularmente, eu já tenho me incomoda esse termo, né? Por essa questão mais geral. Estabilidade de câmbio é desejável, do ponto de vista keynesiano, claro, e autonomia da política monetária, mas mobilidade de capitais, né, não necessariamente. Ainda mais para o caso de países emergentes. Aí depois eu volto para esse ponto. Agora, a minha segunda questão é o seguinte, que o termo mais apropriado, e eu lendo o seu texto eu me lembrei, que é um termo que o Flasbeck utilizou num paper, não é trindade impossível, né? É dualidade impossível. Por quê? Porque com livre mobilidade de capitais não existe autonomia de política monetária. Então, essa dualidade é impossível, livre mobilidade de capitais e autonomia de política monetária, né? Então, a gente aqui, principalmente eu, a Marisa, a gente tem utilizado esse termo, né, tanto nos textos quanto também nas aulas, ou seja, há uma dualidade impossível, né? Nos países emergentes, essa questão se agrava, essa questão se torna muito mais complicada, né? Por a gente chama aqui, e eu já vou entrar com essa questão, que é um tema de pesquisa que eu acho que a gente pode trabalhar junto, pela questão da simetria do sistema monetário e financeiro internacional, né? Pela hierarquia de moedas, mas aí é outra discussão. Eu quero entrar, então, no ponto do Brasil, né? Quando eu passo para a análise dos países emergentes em geral para o Brasil, né, o caso brasileiro, vamos pegar até 2011, porque agora a nossa taxa de juros, você comentou, na verdade, agora a nossa taxa de juros nominal, ela já não é a menor, ela já não é a maior, né? A Rússia está maior, e em termos reais, a China está maior que a gente, e a Rússia também. Então, a primeira posição nesse ranking, né, pelo menos nós perdemos. Então, agora, até 2011, o diferencial de juros no Brasil, como você sabe muito bem, era um absurdo. Então, a gestão do regime de metas de inflação, né, na economia brasileira, com um amplo grau de abertura financeira, né, ela se tornava ainda mais complexa, né, aí como você coloca, por duas razões. Primeiro, o diferencial de juros. Então, por uma questão macroeconômica, né, esse diferencial de juros, ele tanto encarecia as operações de esterilização, tornava ainda mais cara, com base em títulos de curto prazo, o problema que você colocou, como atrair ainda mais fluxo de capitais, né? Agora, o outro problema, no caso do Brasil, que você também comentou, mas eu acho que nesse texto específico você não ressalta tanto, é a combinação do alto grau de abertura financeira com o mercado de derivativos líquido e profundo, né? Então, isso trouxe mais dilemas ainda, bem que entre aspas dilemas, eu vou falar por quê, porque eu acho que durante o período não foi problema para o Banco Central, na gestão da política cambial, né? Porque, na verdade, você mostrou os dados dos fluxos, mas vários trabalhos já mostraram que o principal determinante da apreciação do real durante de 2003 a agosto de 2008, depois de 2009 e 2010, foram as operações com derivativos, né? Mas qual é o meu ponto? Meu ponto é o seguinte, além disso, então, essas duas especificidades tornam a gestão de política monetária com meta de inflação mais complicada. Acontece que, pelo menos na minha leitura, quando o Meireles era presidente do Banco Central, então até você mostrou no gráfico, pelo menos 2003 a 2005, né, a apreciação do real era um objetivo desejável da política monetária. Ele estava, ou seja, você não havia a preocupação do Banco Central, eu vou intervir para conter a apreciação, eu não quero essa apreciação. Na minha leitura, não, é o contrário. A apreciação foi o principal mecanismo de transmissão da política monetária no Brasil. A apreciação cambial, ela garantiu a eficácia do regime de metas lá em todos os anos, né? Por que o Banco Central começa a intervir a partir de 2005? Tá? Aí estou falando assim, a minha leitura, né? Eu também fiz algumas entrevistas e também com base em análise de dados, estatística descritiva sem econometria. Foi para acumular reservas. Claramente, há o objetivo de acumular reservas e tem uma discussão que eu acho muito importante, mas é pouco feita nos textos acadêmicos, que quem faz isso tem um BIS paper, tem vários, não sei se você conhece, sobre Foreign Exchange Market Intervention, de 2005, que chama atenção para o quê? Eu posso ter um regime de câmbio flutuante sujo, que é em todos os países emergentes, com metas de inflação, né? Mas eu tenho diferentes objetivos de política e, assim, metas a serem atingidos, né? Então, nessa leitura, eu acho que na gestão do Henrique Meirelles, e a gente pode dizer, mudou um pouquinho depois que trocou o ministro da Fazenda, pelo Palocci, pelo Mantega, essas coisas bem de política brasileira, mas o objetivo principal da política econômica, no sentido, vamos pensar, monetária, cambial e fiscal, era o controle de inflação. E a política cambial estava subordinada à política monetária. Você não tinha o mínimo preocupação com competitividade externa, enquanto objetivo da política econômica, e assim, enquanto com o patamar da taxa de câmbio, enquanto uma meta da política cambial. Certo? Então, o que eles vão fazer com swaps reversos? Por que eles entram? Você falou, para garantir liquidez. Porque era, no inglês, one-way bet, era apostas unidirecionais em apreciação do real e que se concentravam nos derivativos. Então, o Banco Central entrava, bem à vista, para atenuar a volatilidade e, em alguns momentos, até conter a velocidade de apreciação. Se você pega, em 2008, até o Lehman Brothers, o absurdo que foi os fluxos de capitais para o Brasil e a aposta na apreciação, ainda mais depois do investment grade. Então, naquele contexto, espera aí, a gente tem que segurar um pouco isso aqui, né? O que acontece depois? Né? Eu acho que o problema central que você coloca, olha, como é complicado o manejo da taxa de câmbio, então, quando o Banco Central realmente quer conter a apreciação, eu acho que o governo passa a enfrentar esse problema realmente no governo Dilma. Né? Em que sentido? Porque aí há uma mudança, também, vamos discutir, na minha leitura, você continua com o mesmo regime macroeconômico, que a gente chama aqui o tripé, né? Metas de inflação, câmbio flutuante sujo e metas de superávit primário, mas você muda os objetivos e metas desse regime. Uma forma de dizer o seguinte, você flexibiliza, né, esse regime e, realmente, a competitividade externa passa a ser uma preocupação. Né? Então, nesse contexto, aí realmente o dilema fica muito maior. Como eu vou conseguir atingir controle de inflação, né, e, pelo menos, conter a deterioração da competitividade externa e a desindustrialização, ou outro termo que se queira usar. Né? Nesse contexto, eles só conseguem isso adotando os controles de capitais, mas muito mais do que controles de capitais. Né, que aí vem da especificidade institucional brasileira, né, que você precisa, para aumentar um pouco a autonomia da sua política monetária e cambial, né, porque a gente tem mania de falar só autonomia de política monetária, autonomia de política cambial também. Num regime de câmbio flutuante, num país emergente, você tem que adotar, né, eu tenho usado o termo, tem dois... instrumentos de gestão de fluxos de capitais. Então, no Brasil, não adiantou só adotar controle de capital, teve que adotar regulação prudencial sobre as posições vendidas dos bancos, e mesmo assim não adiantou, porque você teve que adotar um instrumento específico, né, que eu tenho chamado a regulação, instrumento de regulação dos derivativos cambiais. Né, porque como no Brasil, bem que até hoje também, mas hoje diminuiu, depois das medidas. Você pode fazer após derivativos sem entrada de um dólar no país, né? Você não tem nenhum impacto de controle de capital e qualquer instrumento de regulação prudencial que atinge posições à vista. Então, na verdade, o que o governo brasileiro fez até hoje, é o único país, ele adotou um instrumento adicional que a literatura, o FMI, está chamando de controle de capitais. Né? Para mim, não é controle de capitais, porque controle de capitais é controle sobre os fluxos de capitais, certo? Regulação prudencial, aí eu estou usando os termos consagrados na literatura. Regulação prudencial é medidas que afetam ativo e passivo das instituições bancárias. Né? E qual que é o problema dos nossos derivativos? Que não há limite a posições, só os bancos, por causa de Basileia, nem a investidor nacional, nem a investidor estrangeiro. Né? A posição em derivativo. Então, esses dois instrumentos não resolvem. Né? Então, no governo Dilma, realmente, se adotou esse amplo, né, esse em inglês, Toolkit, esse amplo leque de regulação para tentar controlar esses dois preços-chaves. Né? Mas o problema é o seguinte, que eu acho que, novamente, o governo está enfrentando um dilema, porque desde dezembro deixaram de novo o câmbio apreciar. Né? Então, realmente é uma questão de fine tuning, de o que vai ser priorizado. Né? E uma questão interessante, que o Gary teve a discussão aqui da dimensão de economia política, né? Eu acho que essa mudança, né, do governo Dilma para Lula, apesar que é PT, está relacionada com uma mudança na correlação de forças, né? Como maior, pelo menos, influência ou preocupação, ou o governo acordou, ou mesmo a gravidade da situação da indústria brasileira, né, que fez falar o seguinte, não dá mais. Não dá para a gente esquecer a taxa de câmbio. Né? E, para fechar, então, exatamente, falando em taxa de câmbio, eu queria só retomar essa questão da hierarquia de divisas, moedas. Você sabe que eu estou trabalhando com a Bárbara sobre isso, né? Mas... Por isso, porque eu queria chamar a atenção, que no início do seu texto você coloca uma frase, né? The exchange rate plays an important role in these countries, né? as macroeconomic policy tool and development instruments. Por que a taxa de câmbio é um preço-chave ainda mais importante nos países emergentes? Eu acho que isso é uma questão teórica que ainda não foi suficientemente trabalhada, né? E na minha perspectiva, né, da Bárbara, a gente tem trabalhado sobre isso, e também está naquele texto que você conhece com o Rogério, né, relacionado com essa discussão da hierarquia de divisas. Mas, ou seja, o que eu acho que tem uma agenda de pesquisa para explorar, né, essas relações, né? E eu mesma aprendi, a Bárbara está aí, tá? Eu mesma aprendi com a Bárbara que que é uma questão importante, acho, para a gente pensar hoje, Brasil, né, e outros países, os economistas alemães, com que a Bárbara estudou, defendiam o seguinte: olha, para você subir na hierarquia, né, até eu pus aqui em inglês, climb the ladder, né, você subir, tem que fazer superávit em conta corrente e tem que manter a moeda depreciada. Assim que a gente sobe na hierarquia. Né? Então, a taxa de câmbio ela é mais importante, né, porque a nossa moeda não é a moeda reserva, então a incerteza em relação ao seu uso, o seu prêmio de liquidez, como você usou também, é muito mais baixo, etc. Mas também porque, para esses países superarem esse problema estrutural, né, você tem que não só conter a volatilidade, mas também perseguir um patamar, né, depreciado, ou pelo menos não apreciado, que é como você coloca aí. Tá? Então é isso, terminei os comentários.
Obrigada, Daniela, pelos excelentes comentários também. Agora, professor, a Nina vai... Você quer reagir aos comentários?
Só para agradecer os comentários. Não tenho tanto para dizer. I don't have that much to say, but just to say thank you very much for all the comments, and I will take them into consideration. And I particularly like the comment about linking it to the theoretical. To think about why is the exchange rate more important. It's not just because it's a development policy instrument, because we need to industrialize it. It is just because the exchange rate is more important for these countries. And I had, it's slightly unrelated to this, but I did had a long discussion with Marc Lavoie at the Berlin conference, and I was presenting the paper on currency hierarchies and liquidity preference, and he just couldn't, and I was arguing that, so basically it gets a bit technical but he says ultimately the central bank can always control the interest rate. And I kind of try to argue, well, that is only the case if you can ignore the exchange rate. But a country like Brazil, or a developing country, cannot ignore the exchange rate because it has a lower liquidity premium, because it's a currency hierarchy. So that whole assumption that we can conduct independent monetary policy only holds if I don't ignore the exchange rate. I did not convince him. No, I didn't. He used to, because he's such a horizontalist. He just didn't want to accept the fact that, horizontalism might not hold in an open economy. But
Mas você sabe que eu vou aproveitar, você é uma exceção. Você, a Bárbara, que é uma ótima coincidência que vocês estão aqui, porque eu sempre falo, uma coisa que eu costumo falar para os meus alunos é que o Celso Furtado só podia ser brasileiro e o Prebisch argentino. Ou seja, a dificuldade dos economistas, mesmo keynesianos e heterodoxos, de países envolvidos, entenderem algumas especificidades como a hierarquia. Né? Então, quando eu tive a oportunidade de ficar um ano na França, era chocante isso, né? Como menos economistas que a gente admira, lê, concorda, né? Então, me veio isso. Eu falei, peraí, mas ainda bem, eu fico muito feliz de saber que existem pessoas como vocês que vieram de países centrais que conseguem.
I was shocked because for me it wasn't even the question.
A Alemanha teve necessidade do pós-guerra, né? Mas é verdade. E acho que no caso do Lavoie se aplica exatamente isso. É um pouco. E mesmo os pós-keynesianos, né, eu, Rogério, com esse nosso paper sobre a taxa de câmbio, a gente também vai lá, vai ler o John Harvey. Puta, e aí? Eles não avançam. E os emergentes? É tudo igual, né? Então, eu acho que tem uma dificuldade mesmo, né? E pelas ideias tem seu tempo e seu lugar, né? Nesse caso, tem o seu lugar, né? Então, eu acho que é realmente a gente tem muita possibilidade de avançar teoricamente, né? E e conjuntamente nessa discussão.
Ótimo, gente. Bom, agora a gente vai abrir para perguntas. A gente ainda tem um tempinho. Posso fazer uma primeira? Vou abusar do meu...
Controle de capitais.
eu queria saber qual foi o resultado da pesquisa sobre, no quesito controle de capitais. Eu fiquei curiosa.
So what I found is that the people who really don't mind, so I mean it's not that surprising, but basically long-term investors, so it's real money funds I call them, so they hold the Brazilian bonds for around 2 or 3 years. They have no problem with capital control, so they have no problem with, for example, a transaction tax or Tobin tax. Quite to the contrary, they would probably advocate it because it takes a bit of the volatility out. So they like that. Whereas a short-term trader, and on the other spectrum, there the real short-term traders, the flow traders, they also didn't mind so much. The ones who really mind it are the hedge funds, because the hedge funds have a kind of a 3 months horizon for which it really impacts the profitability. So that was the difference.
Então, de qualquer jeito, os controles acabam alterando a composição, o tipo de investidor, né? Você tem um impacto no...
Nesse sentido, do perfil do
My problem
investimento.
is that ultimately, because I think a lot of the appreciation, we always bash the hedge funds because they're the ones that are volatile, but the carry trade is actually done by the longer term guys, because the real money funds, they buy a Brazilian bond and hold it. They invest into the interest rate. A hedge fund doesn't really invest into interest rate. A hedge fund just trades the exchange rate. They trade on the back of the real money people. So, yes, there would be a change in the composition of capital inflows, but that wouldn't necessarily mean it would help us with the appreciation. One thing it would do is it would probably make it a bit less volatile, because they wouldn't pull out at any kind of whenever there's a change out there. So the carry trade, that's another thing I found really interesting. The carry trade is actually something which nobody does. Carry trade, me, no. And which is really the more real money guys, the longer term investors which hold the bonds. The hedge funds, they speculate on the exchange rate.
Alguém se habilita? Bárbara.
Fala. E vou continuar a responder em inglês.
Eu gostei muito dessa conversa pós-apresentação sobre a contextualização teórica e a relevância da taxa de câmbio, mas não é isso que eu queria tocar no assunto agora. Uma pergunta à sua apresentação. O que eu mais gostei e acho realmente muito interessante é o problema de uma intervenção assimétrica do Banco Central que convida a especulação em favor a uma apreciação.
Isso é.
Mas minha pergunta é se isso é realmente ligado ao regime de inflation targeting, ou se isso não vale para todo tipo de política econômica que prioriza a estabilidade da inflação por qualquer maneira. Então, qual é a relevância do inflation targeting na sua...
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a general problem because we need to control the inflation. I think the only thing that in an inflation targeting regime, it's institutionalized. You are required to maintain the inflation target within 2%. So it becomes a much more... So for example, there's...
Pursue orthodox monetary policy or economic policy, you're obliged. Everybody looks on the inflation rate as the same. Inflation targeting was supposed to be more flexible in the instrument of controlling inflation. But the target of maintaining inflation rather low seems to be unchanged if you use it.
Yeah, I think, after the crisis. Or generally.
Before the introduction of inflation target.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it has become a bit more flexible, but I think what the notion I got from discussing with people from the central bank, the central bank is required to, for example, as soon as when they do sterilization operations and the money supply increases, they're required through the institutional framework of an inflation targeting regime to intervene and to kind of sterilize these purchases, which brings the problems which I've talked about. Obviously, there might be monetary policy arrangements where the government by itself is committed to controlling the inflation, but it becomes much less institutionalized and in a way much less predictable and transparent and clear. Yeah. So for an investor, if you have an inflation targeting regime, they know this is the framework. Whereas if there's a government which does that, it all becomes a bit more dodgy because you need to know about the country, you need to invest knowing about that country, you need to know how the central bank operates, you need to know that even explicitly they haven't said it that they're targeting inflation, they are doing this. So there's much more effort, much more time, much more transaction costs involved. Whereas an inflation targeting regime, in a way, you don't need to do that. So it makes it easier for an investor. But I do see where you're coming from, but I do think it adds a kind of additional.
Mais alguém?
Eu tenho uma pergunta para a professora, na verdade, só talvez fuja um pouco desse tema, mas é a questão que a senhora tocou na questão de competitividade e desindustrialização da economia brasileira. Qual é o real impacto da taxa de câmbio nesse problema? E não seria talvez um problema estrutural na competitividade do sistema? Não teria outros fatores que seriam mais importantes, né, na influência dessa desindustrialização da economia brasileira, nessa falta de competitividade que a gente tem? Porque a gente sempre fala que é a taxa de câmbio, mas não tem os problemas fundamentais como educação, outros fatores que influenciariam mais nessa falta de competitividade?
Olha, primeiro, claro que não é só taxa de câmbio, né? Porque aqui o nosso tema é política monetária e cambial. O problema da perda de competitividade das exportações, vamos falar, né, industriais, né, e de maior valor agregado brasileiro, tem vários determinantes, né? Tem a questão da apreciação cambial, e aí a gente pode até, isso aí, a literatura, né, desde o caldo, com toda, e várias outras tradições também de estruturalistas, né, que a taxa de câmbio importa e países que tiveram uma trajetória de industrialização bem sucedida, né, sustentaram moedas depreciadas. Né? Então tem, né, uma literatura empírica que vai nessa direção. Agora, o caso do Brasil, então a taxa de câmbio é um problema. A composição das exportações brasileiras, a gente exportava os bens de maior valor agregado, né, que são os mais desejáveis por gerar aumento de produtividade, ter efeitos dinâmicos na economia, né? América Latina e Estados Unidos principalmente. Então, o que vai acontecendo? Eu acho que muda depois da crise. Antes da crise, a gente exportava commodities para a China e os países latino-americanos também, isso continua tudo bem, mas a gente se beneficiava com esse efeito que eu chamo complementariedade da China, exportando manufaturados para a América Latina. Né? O que eu acho que aconteceu, e isso a gente vai comprovar estudando a pauta importadora dos nossos principais parceiros comerciais na América Latina, que a China está ganhando cada vez mais espaço nesses países. Então, tem dois autores, tem um texto ótimo, mas em 2004, que são ingleses, que chamam a atenção para isso, o efeito complementariedade e concorrência da China, concorrência no mercado de manufaturados. Então, eu acho que está começando a ter um desequilíbrio, ou já pode estar tendo esse desequilíbrio. Né? Em que sentido? A China está invadindo cada vez mais nossos mercados de manufaturados, né? Então esse efeito negativo da concorrência, né, vai anulando cada vez mais o efeito complementariedade das commodities. Né? Então eu acho que para analisar essa questão de indústria brasileira, também não é a minha principal área, né? O Sérgio Fernando tinha que estar aqui. A gente tem que olhar também essa questão da China. Né? Mas aí, se você se interessa pelo tema, é um ótimo tema para ser pesquisado.
Essa questão que sempre ficava caindo uma taxa de câmbio, mas existem outros problemas.
Claro.
Não, você tem razão.
Qual que é a real
vários fatores. Dá para fazer vários estudos, inclusive setoriais, para você ver ao longo da cadeia industrial, né, que setores que a carga tributária pesa mais, que setor que o custo de energia, que setor que, que a taxa de câmbio. Né? Então, tem realmente, e quanto maior a diversidade da estrutura industrial produtiva, mais complexo é. Então, desse ponto de vista, ainda bem que nós temos ainda essa complexidade. Né? Você vai olhar os outros países latino-americanos, praticamente são commodities. Né? Então, o Brasil também enfrenta tantos dilemas, porque é também uma economia que ainda tem, né, uma estrutura, não conseguiram ainda destruir totalmente. Né? Mas eu acho que é uma área que ainda também tem muito a ser pesquisado e estudado no Brasil. Né?
And in reality, so I think one of the projects we would quite like to do together is to look a bit how important the exchange rate really is and how this financialization process of the exchange is important for non-financial corporations. No?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So this is one area we want to try to explore together. Okay. Well, thanks a lot. Go home, enjoy the afternoon.
Gente, muito obrigada pelas duas professoras e para vocês. Muito obrigada a vocês.
And maybe I see one of you in Leeds. If you have any questions, then please, you can also always contact me via email. Yeah, so if you have any questions about coming to Leeds or anything in general, then don't hesitate to contact me. Aí não sei.
Sim,
vou perguntar.
Mas sim,
tá,
vamos
ver se
providenciar isso. Sim.
Eu acho que podia deixar lá no Xerox, né?
Não tem mais Xerox.
Não, mas tem lá na educação.
Ah, na educação.
Esse é um problema, né? Mas assim, vamos pular essa questão. Não tem um site, não tem lugar para contexto na internet.
Ah, é verdade.
Porque era legal ter um lugar na página, né, para colocar.
Vamos ver se a gente pendura lá. Boa ideia.
Boa ideia.
Tá bom, muito obrigada a vocês.
Para você.